The Winter Solstice Pact. The winter night was bitter, the air sharp enough to cut. Snow fell in heavy silence, cloaking the town in an eerie stillness. Our old farmhouse creaked with the weight of the cold, the windows frosting over as the wood stove struggled to keep us warm. The kids were asleep upstairs, their small breaths clouding the icy air of their room, and I sat by the fire, a blanket draped across my shoulders. Emma had gone to bed early, claiming a headache. The house felt impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for sound. It was then that I noticed it, a faint rustling, not inside the house, but outside. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but the sound persisted, too deliberate, too steady. I rose, reluctant to leave the fire, and made my way to the front door. The cold bit at my face as I opened it, and for a moment I saw nothing but the swirling snow. But then I looked down and froze. There on the snow-dusted porch lay a single envelope. Its surface was slick and black, the color of wet ink, and it shimmered faintly in the dim light of the porch lantern. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. The tracks leading to the porch were almost erased by the snowfall, as though whoever had left it had vanished into the storm. The envelope was cold to the touch as I picked it up, and the seal, a strange symbol of twisting branches, cracked with an almost reluctant sigh as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of thick, yellowed paper. The handwriting was elegant but uneven, as if written in haste. To the deserving, on the longest night, prosperity awaits. Join us for the Winter Solstice Feast at Black Pine Manor. A seat is prepared for your family. Do not delay. There was no signature, no return address, only a small map etched into the bottom corner, marking a location deep in the woods. Black Pine Manor. It was a name I'd heard in whispers around town, but had never seen for myself. Emma and I had moved to this remote area only a few months ago, and the locals, though polite, had always been cagey about certain topics. This was one of them. I turned the letter over in my hands, my breath curling in the freezing air. There was something about it, something almost magnetic. It felt like an opportunity, though, for what? I couldn't say. I should have thrown it into the fire and gone back inside. But I didn't. By morning, the unease had faded, replaced by curiosity. At breakfast, I showed Emma the letter, her brow furrowing as she read. This has to be some sort of prank, she said, pushing her hair back and setting the letter on the table. No one just invites strangers to a feast in the middle of the woods. It's probably one of those community things, I suggested. You know, like a potluck. Emma gave me a look. In Black Pine Manor? That place is abandoned. I shrugged, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. To be honest, neither was I. Still, the idea intrigued me, a strange, nagging pull that I couldn't shake. I thought about the kids, how hard it had been to make this move, how much they missed the life we'd left behind. A celebration might be good for them, a chance to feel like we belonged. That evening, as the snowstorm eased, we bundled up and piled into the car. The forest road was narrow and treacherous, the headlights cutting through the thick trees. The kids were quiet in the back seat, their faces pressed to the frosted windows as the trees loomed taller around us. Even Emma, who usually chattered through car rides, was silent, her hands gripping the seat as the map led us deeper into the woods. When we finally arrived, the sight of Black Pine Manor took my breath away. It stood at the heart of a vast clearing, its towering frame stark against the snow. The building was ancient, its spires and gables draped in frost, and every window glowed with the warm, flickering light of candles. Smoke curled from its chimneys, and the sound of faint music drifted through the night. We stepped out of the car, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound as we approached the massive double doors. They swung open before I could knock, revealing a tall man in a fur-lined cloak. His face was angular, his eyes pale and sharp, and his smile showed too many teeth. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and deep. "We've been expecting you." Emma shot me a look, but it was too late to turn back. As we crossed the threshold, a strange, heavy warmth enveloped me, and the door closed behind us with a resounding thud. The interior of Black Pine Manor was a world away from the snowy desolation outside. Warm light poured from chandeliers draped in greenery, their candles casting shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. A roaring fire dominated one end of the hall, while long, dark wooden tables stretched across the space, laden with gleaming silverware and intricate dishes that seemed to steam with impossible warmth. The air smelled of spices and roasted meat, but there was something sharp beneath it, an acrid tang that prickled the back of my throat. The host, who had introduced himself only as Mistress, ushered us into the dining room. Other guests were already seated, their faces pale but fixed with tight smiles. There was an air of reverence, as if we had entered a sacred space. "This way," Mistress said, guiding us to seats near the head of the table. His eyes lingered on Emma and the kids, his smile growing wider as Ellie shyly hid behind her chair. I caught Emma's hand trembling as she reached for my arm. The table was too perfect, every plate identical, every goblet filled to the brim with a deep, dark liquid that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. As we settled in, I noticed the guests avoided looking directly at the food, their glances darting between their laps and the host as though waiting for a signal. Mistress took his place at the head of the table, raising his goblet with a flourish. "On this longest night, we come together," he intoned, his voice echoing unnaturally in the vast hall. "To honor the solstice, to welcome its gifts, and to share in the bounty of Black Pine." His words drew a ripple of murmurs from the other guests, and they followed his lead, raising their goblets with trembling hands. I hesitated, the weight of his gaze settling heavily on me. "Please," he said, the word a velvet command. "Drink. Tonight all are equal under the solstice moon." The goblet was cold in my hand, its surface etched with swirling patterns that seemed to shift under the light. The liquid inside was darker than wine, thicker too, with an aroma that was cloyingly sweet. I glanced at Emma, her eyes wide as she stared at her drink, and I shook my head, just enough for her to see. But as I raised the goblet to my lips, the air in the room seemed to shift. The shadows cast by the fire grew sharper, stretching like claws across the walls. A soft rustling sound like dry leaves whispered at the edges of my hearing. My heartbeat quickened and I hesitated. Mistress's gaze locked onto mine, his smile hardening. "Drink," he repeated, the weight of his voice sinking into my chest like a stone. I took a sip. The liquid was sweet and metallic, like honeyed rust, and it burned as it slid down my throat. For a moment the room seemed to tilt, the lights blurring as a faint ringing filled my ears. When I set the goblet down, my hand shook. The meal began. Dishes were passed around with solemn precision, roasted meats glistening in thick gravies, vegetables so brightly colored they seemed unnatural, and dense, dark breads. But as I lifted my fork, I noticed something odd. The food didn't steam as it should have. The meat's juices pooled on the plate, but the air around it was cold, lifeless. Ellie poked at her plate, her little face scrunched in confusion. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging at my sleeve. "It tastes funny." I glanced at her plate. The food had an oily sheen under the candlelight, and her bread looked wrong, too smooth, like polished stone. Emma squeezed my hand under the table, her grip tight. "Just eat what you can, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. As the meal wore on, the other guests began to change. Their faces grew pale and slack, their movements jerky, as though they were marionettes struggling against invisible strings. A man at the far end of the table dropped his fork and the sound rang out sharply in the heavy air. Mistress turned toward him, his smile never faltering. "Is something wrong, Mr. Graves?" he asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The man's face twisted in anguish, and he clutched his stomach. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he fell forward, his goblet tipping over and spilling its dark contents onto the pristine tablecloth. The liquid hissed where it landed, smoke rising in thin tendrils. I stared, my stomach twisting as the other guests averted their eyes. Unfortunate, Mistress said softly. Two attendants appeared as if from nowhere, lifting the man's limp body and carrying it away. The goblet and its spilled contents vanished too, leaving no trace. Emma's hand tightened around mine. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." I nodded, my heart pounding. But as I glanced toward the door, Mistress's eyes met mine and his smile grew. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice light but edged with steel. "The solstice has only just begun." The air in the manor had changed. It was heavier now, pressing against my chest with every breath. The shadows no longer danced but writhed, their movements deliberate and unnerving. "Please," Emma whispered, clutching my arm. "We have to get out of here." I glanced at the children. Ellie clung to her mother, her eyes wide with fear, while James's face had gone pale, his small body trembling. I nodded, forcing calm into my voice. "We'll go. Stay close." But as we stood, Mistress rose from his seat, his movement unnaturally smooth. "I insist you stay for the conclusion," he said, his words heavy with a power I couldn't name. "The solstice feast is not complete without its final offering." The guests turned toward us in unison, their faces blank, their eyes shining with a dull, inhuman light. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. The room seemed to constrict around us, the air thick and buzzing with a faint, low hum. I tightened my grip on Emma's hand and stepped in front of Ellie and James. Mistress's smile didn't falter, but his eyes. They gleamed with something sharp, predatory. "Final offering?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We didn't agree to this." "You didn't need to," Mistress said smoothly, as though explaining an obvious truth to a child. "Your presence here was agreement enough. The solstice demands tribute, and you were chosen." The words hung in the air, each syllable sinking into me like a barbed hook. Around us, the other guests rose from their chairs in unison. They moved stiffly, their heads tilting as if pulled by invisible strings. Their faces were no longer entirely human, jaws too wide, skin stretched thin, their eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight like shards of glass. Ellie whimpered behind me and I turned, crouching to look into her terrified face. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered, though my own voice shook. "Stay close to Mommy, don't let go." Emma's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line as she clutched both children to her. "What do we do?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "Run," I said. It was the only word that came to me. But as I turned toward the door, two of the guests stepped forward, blocking the way. Their movements were jagged, marionette-like, and the air around them rippled faintly, as though reality itself were bending under their weight. "You can't leave," Mistress said, his tone light, almost amused. "The solstice ritual is sacred, older than these walls, older than you. To flee now would be unwise." I could feel Emma's breath quicken behind me, her grip on the kids tightening. My heart pounded and my mind raced for a plan. The windows? Too high and narrow. The servant's door? It was behind the table, blocked by those lifeless, staring faces. Then, without warning, Mistress raised his hand, and the room plunged into darkness. Ellie screamed, and I grabbed for her blindly, pulling her against me as I fumbled for Emma. The hum in the air grew louder, pulsing like the beat of a massive, unseen heart. The candles flared back to life, but the room was no longer the same. The table was gone, replaced by a circle of carved stone set into the floor, its edges etched with runes that glowed faintly red. The walls of the manor stretched impossibly high, the ceiling lost in darkness. Around the circle, the guests stood motionless, their bodies casting shadows that didn't align with the flickering light. Mistress stood at the center of the circle, his arms raised, his fur cloak billowing in an unfelt wind. His voice rang out, deep and resonant, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The sound crawled across my skin, each word a dagger that cut deeper into my chest. "What is this?" Emma gasped, her voice high and panicked. "A summoning," I said before I could stop myself. The realization hit me like a blow. Those runes, the strange ritual, the way Maestress's words seemed to pull at something unseen. This was no mere tradition. This was ancient and wrong and powerful. The stone beneath Maestress began to shift, the runes burning brighter. A low, guttural sound filled the air, not quite a growl, not quite a moan. It was the sound of something vast and hungry, awakening. "Tonight, we honor the pact," Maestress intoned, his voice rising above the sound. "The spirit of the solstice awakens. It will feast, and in return, we will prosper." The ground trembled, and from the center of the circle, the stone cracked, a fissure spreading outward like a spider's web. Something black and viscous oozed up through the crack, pooling and writhing as if alive. The shape of it twisted and grew, rising higher and higher, its surface gleaming with a sickly, otherworldly light. A hand emerged from the ooze. No, not a hand. It was too long, its fingers too thin, and its nails too sharp. Then came the head, featureless save for two hollow eyes that burned with cold, white fire. The thing pulled itself free of the fissure, its body shifting and expanding, its presence filling the room with a crushing weight. Ellie screamed again, and this time, I couldn't blame her. My own throat burned with the urge to scream, but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to stay upright. "We have to move," I said, grabbing Emma's arm. "Now." "But how?" she whispered, tears streaking her face. I glanced around, my mind racing. The guests were still watching us, their eyes unblinking. The spirit, or whatever it was, loomed over Maestress, its head tilting as though listening to his words. And then I saw it. A narrow doorway, half hidden behind one of the massive tapestries lining the walls. A servant's passage, maybe. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. "Follow me," I said, gripping Emma's hand. "And don't look back." The spirit let out a sound, a low, echoing wail that seemed to pierce straight through my skull. The guests turned as one, their heads snapping toward us with unnatural speed. Maestress's chant grew louder, faster, and I knew we didn't have much time. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Emma and the kids toward the door. The room erupted into chaos. The moment we broke into a run, the guests moved. Their jerky, puppet-like steps turned into horrifyingly fluid strides, their faces twisting with something between rage and hunger. The spirit above Maestress let out another deafening wail, and the entire room seemed to pulse in response. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, reaching for us like living things. "Don't look back!" I yelled, gripping Ellie's hand tightly. Emma held James in her arms, her face pale but determined as we rushed toward the tapestry-covered doorway. Behind us, I heard the heavy, wet slither of the spirit dragging itself fully from the fissure. It sounded enormous, its weight cracking the stone floor as it moved. The air grew colder with each passing second, and that awful hum resonated in my bones, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. The tapestry parted under my hand, revealing a narrow wooden door. I shoved it open and pushed Emma and the kids through, slamming it shut behind us. The dim corridor beyond was claustrophobic, its low ceiling forcing me to hunch as we ran. The air was stale and damp, the flickering light from a single wall-mounted lantern barely illuminating the path ahead. "Where are we going?" Emma gasped, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hoarse. "But we have to keep moving." The sound of splintering wood echoed from behind us, followed by a chorus of inhuman shrieks. I didn't dare look back. The passage twisted and turned, each step taking us deeper into the bowels of the manor. I could feel the vibrations of the spirit's movements through the floor, each tremor a reminder of how close it was. James whimpered in Emma's arms, his small hands gripping her coat like a lifeline. At last, the corridor opened into a larger room. It was circular, the walls lined with towering shelves filled with dusty, leather-bound books. In the center stood an altar, carved from dark stone and covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the gloom. "What is this place?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, I said, scanning the room desperately. But it's a dead end. The door behind us rattled violently, and I grabbed a heavy book from the nearest shelf, wedging it against the handle. It wouldn't hold for long, but it might buy us a few precious moments. Emma set James down and held Ellie close. "What now?" she asked, her voice breaking. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, searching for anything, any way out. The runes on the altar seemed to shift under my gaze, their patterns twisting into something familiar. A memory surfaced, something Maestress had said about the solstice and the ancient pact. "This altar," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It has to be part of the ritual." Ellie tugged at my sleeve, her small voice cutting through the panic. "Daddy, what's happening? I'm scared." I crouched down, pulling her into a hug. "I know, sweetheart," I said, forcing my voice to steady. "I'm scared too. But we're going to get through this, okay? We just have to be brave." The door cracked open, splinters raining onto the floor. Behind it, the guests surged forward, their grotesque faces peering into the room. "Help me!" Emma screamed, grabbing a heavy candelabra and swinging it at the first guest to enter. The blow connected, sending the figure sprawling, but it didn't stay down. It rose with impossible speed, its head tilting at an unnatural angle as it lunged for her. I grabbed the closest object I could find, a rusted iron rod, and swung it with all my strength. The creature collapsed, its body convulsing before going still. The others hesitated at the doorway, their heads snapping toward the altar. The runes were glowing brighter now, pulsing in time with the spirit's distant wail. "They're afraid of it," I realized aloud. Emma turned to me, her eyes wide. "What does that mean?" I hesitated, the pieces falling into place in my mind. "I think the altar can stop it. The spirit. The ritual's not complete yet. We can break it." "How?" I stared at the altar, the runes shimmering like embers. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaking. "But we don't have another choice." I reached for the altar, my hand hovering above its surface. The stone felt alive, vibrating faintly under my palm. As my fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through me and I cried out, pulling back. The runes flared brighter, and the spirit's wail grew louder, angrier. "It's reacting to you," Emma said, her voice urgent. "Try again." Gritting my teeth, I pressed my hands to the altar. The pain was unbearable, like fire coursing through my veins, but I didn't let go. The runes flared, their light filling the room, and the guests at the doorway recoiled, their shrieks rising into a deafening cacophony. The floor trembled violently, and I felt the weight of the spirit's presence bearing down on me. My vision blurred, but I could see its shadow looming through the cracked door, its hollow eyes burning with rage. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't know who I was pleading with. The light from the altar surged, blinding and cold, and the spirit let out a final, shattering wail. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the room was still. The guests were gone, the doorway empty. The altar was dark, its runes lifeless. "Is it over?" Emma whispered. "I don't know," I said, pulling Ellie into my arms as my knees buckled. "But we're alive. For now." The silence in the room was suffocating, the kind that presses into your ears and chest until you can barely think. The altar stood lifeless, its once glowing runes now cold and dark. Around us, the air felt heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Ellie clung to my neck, her small frame trembling against me. Emma knelt beside James, stroking his hair as she murmured soothing words, though her own voice was frayed with fear. I wanted to believe it was over, that we had broken whatever curse Maestress had unleashed, but deep down, I knew better. "Stay here," I said, rising to my feet. "No," Emma said sharply, grabbing my arm. "You're not leaving us." "I have to check. If this thing isn't really gone..." My voice trailed off. I couldn't say it. I couldn't give shape to the possibility that we hadn't escaped. Emma's grip faltered and she nodded reluctantly. "Be careful." I moved toward the door, every step feeling like wading through thick, invisible sludge. The passage beyond was eerily quiet, the sound of my breathing unnaturally loud in my ears. The walls seemed narrower now, their dark stone surfaces pressing inward. As I reached the main hall, the smell hit me first, thick and cloying, like burnt hair and spoiled meat. The remnants of the feast were still there, but they were no longer food. The dishes were now piled with rotted, blackened flesh, maggots writhing in the decayed remains. Goblets that had once glimmered with dark liquid now brimmed with something thicker, something that smelled of iron and rot. The guests were gone. At least I thought they were until I saw the shadows. They lined the walls, indistinct shapes that twitched and shifted as though caught in an unseen wind. Their forms were vaguely human but stretched, grotesque, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't approach me, but their heads, or what I assumed were their heads, turned toward me in unison. I couldn't see their eyes, but I felt their stares boring into me, colder than the winter outside. A low creak drew my attention to the center of the room. The fissure in the floor was still there, a jagged wound in the stone. Black ooze seeped lazily from its edges, the surface rippling as though something beneath was still alive, still waiting. And then, I saw him. Maestro stood near the edge of the fissure, his once pristine cloak now tattered and soaked with dark stains. His face was no longer human. His features had melted and stretched, his skin pale and slick like wax left too close to a flame. His mouth was a wide, jagged maw that didn't belong on any living creature. "You think it's over?" he said, his voice a garbled mockery of its former smoothness. "Fools. The solstice is eternal. You cannot unmake what has been bound." I stepped back, bile rising in my throat. "We stopped it," I said, though my voice trembled. "The altar." Maestrus let out a noise that was somewhere between a laugh and a growl. "You stalled it. The spirit was summoned, its hunger awakened. It will not be denied." The room quaked as the fissure began to widen, the black ooze spilling out in great waves. Shapes emerged from it, twisting, writhing things that defied logic, their forms constantly shifting as though reality itself couldn't decide what they were. I ran. The passage back to the others felt endless, each step stretching out as though the hall were growing beneath my feet. The walls seemed to close in, the faint sound of whispers trailing me, urging me to turn back. But I didn't. When I burst into the room where I'd left Emma and the kids, they were already on their feet. "We need to go," I gasped, grabbing Ellie and pulling James to his feet. "What happened?" Emma demanded, her voice rising in panic. "No time," I said, dragging them toward another door on the far side of the room. Behind us, I heard the sound of stone splitting, the hum of that awful energy growing louder. The manor itself seemed to groan in protest, its ancient walls buckling under the strain. We found a stairwell, narrow and spiraling, and began to climb. Each step was a struggle, the air growing colder and thinner the higher we went. Somewhere far below, I heard Maestrus's voice rising in a hideous chant, the words twisting the air like a physical force. Finally, we reached the top, a single door, its wood warped and splintered with age. I threw my shoulder against it, and it burst open, spilling us into the night. The cold wind hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. We were outside. We were free. Behind us, Black Pine Manor loomed against the night sky, its windows glowing with an unnatural, pulsing light. The ground beneath it cracked and split, and from its depths, the shadow of the spirit began to rise, towering and endless. We didn't stop running. When we finally reached the car, I shoved the kids inside and climbed into the driver's seat. Emma was beside me, her face pale and streaked with tears. As I sped down the narrow forest road, the glow of the manor faded behind us. But the hum remained, faint and distant, a reminder that the solstice was far from over. and in the rearview mirror I could still see the shadows following us.